at this sad time, it also is a chance to perhaps reflect a little on where we live, where we're privileged to work between Silicon Valley, Stanford University, and I tried to pull this together with those pieces in mind. By way of disclosure, I do work with a number of early stage med tech companies. None of them are relevant, but all of them have been instructive in terms of what works, what doesn't work, and how one stays agile across the spectrum of trying to develop new technologies to solve old problems taking care of patients. I have 4 quick objectives that I'll try to outline. First, we'll start with a selective review of the evolution of Silicon Valley, then discuss the contributions of our university in that ecosystem, try to extract a few key ecosystem traits that I think are success traits, and then talk a little about how the Department of Surgery broadly and Biodesign at Stanford and the Fogarty Institute have tried to operationalize those principles. So first, a quick select review of the evolution of the place that we call home. So this is a picture of lightning striking over Silicon Valley, and it strikes both literally and figuratively. Over 75 years, Hewlett-Packard, Sun Microsystems, Intel, Cisco, Apple, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, and a host of others have represented lightning strikes that have absolutely changed our world. It started years ago, and I think it's fair to say that geography is destiny. California, in particular NorCal, is Western and open. The people that come here have been pioneering. They've been non-hierarchical, and there's been, if not perfect, perhaps a better meritocracy than many places. Stanford University has its origins on the Leland-Stanford farm. The university was founded in 1891 on this 8,000 acres, and the term "the farm" is reflective of its previous life. The university was founded and commemorates the life and death of Leland Stanford Jr., their only child, who died at 15 years of age while traveling in Europe. Famously, at the chartering of the university, this grief-stricken family, specifically in the charter, said, quote, "The children of California will be our children." Stanford as a university has been innovative from the start. In 1891, it was one of the few co-ed universities. It was one of the few non-denominational universities. And also in the charter was a acknowledgement and a specific charge to do things that are useful. The early years, as we faced the troubles of today, were also tumultuous. 2 years after the university was founded, the founding chair, Leland Stanford, died. Financial crises beset this early fledgling university, and the then president spoke and said the future of the university hung by a thread. A number of years later, Jane Stanford died, and in an earthquake leveled a huge component of the campus. So we are no strangers to trouble, turmoil, and we have consistently met those troubles and turmoil with resolve. Post-World War II, the university really came into its position of preeminence and served as the birthplace of Silicon Valley as a consequence of the evolution of radar, sonar, and microelectronics. Hewlett-Packard was the original of the microelectronics companies. Semiconductors were invented first in the Shockley laboratory at Stanford, and then commercialized at Shockley, Fairchild, and now a little company we know as Intel. The Chaffee lab established the protocols for DSL, one of the most important intellectual properties that have come out of the university. and that's been followed by Sun Microsystems, Cisco, SGI, Yahoo, and Google. All of this is a very clear consequence of the commitment of this great university to research, education, and translation. It doesn't have to be research and education or translation. It can be and. Over 75 years, the university has evolved, first from an orchard to now the valley as we know it. In addition to microelectronics and semiconductors, the web, internet technology, and now clean tech. And there's a clear consequence of a unique ecosystem of capitals, read assets, that include intellectual capital, frequently in universities, but not only, venture capital, and we'll talk a little more about how I learned about risk capital. Many of you may have forgotten that Stanford Medicine was originally headquartered in San Francisco on the campus now of CPMC, but the medical school and the hospital moved from San Francisco in 1959, a fateful decision for all of us. When you look across at the remarkable contributions, many of them kind of indicated in the little signposts here, it leads one to think, is there something unique about the culture in Silicon Valley that has created this remarkable ecosystem of contributions, not just locally, regionally, nationally, but internationally? If it were not for the discoveries and the commercializations done here, we wouldn't be having this meeting. It's worth reflecting that post-World War II, many of the returning GIs who were from the Midwest and the East had shipped out through the West Coast to the Pacific Theater. Following that horrific ordeal, those that returned were glad to have survived. They figured nothing could kill them. They had a maturity and a sense of urgency, and the GI Bill created educational opportunities, which remains the bedrock for both equality and progress. A West Coast ethos evolved of what I like to call work hard, play hard, and while not perfect, a relative meritocracy. Coupled with that, a flat hierarchy, so that if you think about it, Andy Grove, Vinod Koshal, and Jerry Yang, all first-generation immigrants to this country, each followed game-changing companies and technologies that are, again, responsible for what we're able to do today. The science and technology focus at universities, especially Stanford, sharpened, and the President Sterling and Provost Terman at Stanford took advantage of the confluence of intellectual and risk capital, and simultaneously, because of early stage biotech startups, specifically Genentech, Sand Hill Road emerged as a venture capital and investment epicenter. A really important, what I'll call megatrend, is the rise of intellectual capital as the key currency. For the first time, a world war was won, not with brute force, but with science and technology. Radar, sonar, and the Manhattan Project multiplied and leveraged human effort and enabled the World War II to be brought to a close. Importantly, a paper at the end of the war was written by Vannevar Bush entitled The Endless Frontier, which predicted that university research would be an engine not just of military, but of economic power. The NIH was formed, the National Science Foundation was formed, and the Office of Naval Research were formed. Important messages for our government and for those who doubt the value and power of science, technology, and truth. Our president and provost saw it and capitalized on it, and this university has never been the same. It's worth acknowledging that many of the phenomenal discoveries and breakthroughs of the past 75 years have originated in university laboratories. There's a remarkable intellectual horsepower, not just of our faculty, but of our students, our postdocs, And our educational environment enables us to de-risk processes cheaply in the education of our young people. And these technology developments become a critical engine to economic growth. Most importantly, those discoveries and translations must be transferred out of the university, facilitated by what John Hennessy our past president, used to call the porous walls. Wasn't just in the university. There's a tremendous tradition of research in think tanks, and I'll call to your mind XEROX PARC. That's Palo Alto Research Center, which was a unique offshoot of XEROX, which was developing paper copying, and arguably it became the greatest collection of computer talent ever assembled. XEROX PARC, shown here, conceptualized desktop computing, Ethernet networking, graphical user interfaces, scalable type. The mouse and the laser printer were all invented at XEROX. In fact, everything we now call the personal computer was invented there. Who knew that? Famously, when Apple sued Microsoft over the Windows architecture, Microsoft's defense was Apple stole it from XEROX. The defense won, and the contributions from XEROX were forever recognized and noted. I'll call to your attention a remarkable individual at XEROX PARC, Alan Kay, who joined at the beginning, and famously in a paper published in 1972, check that date, 1972, conceptualized what he called the Dynabook. You notice in the picture what looks absolutely like a tablet computer. It took about 60 years to make that happen, but he conceptualized that in 1972. Most importantly, also in the paper, he demonstrated the very simple concept that this would be so easy that even children could use it. Now, of course, it's only kids that know how to use it. Kay was rebuffed by senior leadership at XEROX headquarters. He was told they were interested in following trends. He famously said, look, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that became the catchphrase and in many ways the mantra for Silicon Valley ever since. He received the Turing Award in 2003, which is the Nobel Prize in Computer Science. And it's also worth acknowledging and congratulating past President John Hennessy, who received that same award, I think, in 2018. If you're interested in the evolution of the Valley, in addition to the book Dealers of Lightning, I recommend the book Troublemakers, Silicon Valley's Coming of Age. It tells much of this story in great detail. Leslie Berlin is an awesome author and really brings the story to life. Now I want to talk a little bit about the contributions of our university to this ecosystem. So sitting very much at the epicenter of the Valley is this beautiful academic village founded in the grief of the parents of Leland Stanford Jr., which has evolved into this spectacular campus. And most importantly, in the upper corner here, you see the medical center where all of us are privileged to work, live, and play. Over the decades, people in the Valley have thought differently. Going back to the founding of the university in 1891, one observer said, quote, "A prevailing spirit of optimism prompted us to dare greatly. Nothing has changed." The founding president in his inaugural address said, "Stanford is hallowed by no traditions and thus hampered by none." Bob Noyce, who founded Intel, famously said, "Don't be encumbered by history, go off and do something wonderful." And finally, Alan Kay, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So yes, Stephanie, I do like the aphorisms because I think they capture a kernel of wisdom in a way that we can remember it. So mindset matters, that tolerance for risk, and that fundamental notion of meritocracy. Again, as we indicated, most importantly, all of the discoveries and developments in biomedicine and in computational science need to transfer out of the university, and the porous walls that Hennessy so espoused have really given him the title of one of the founding fathers of Silicon Valley and one of the co-founders of a little company called Google. John was a graduate student thesis advisor to Larry and Sergey. The two of them each thought the other was arrogant. Hennessy was able to bring them together and magic happened. Those porous walls in the medtech world have facilitated an enormous number of early stage medical technologies that now take care of millions and millions of patients across the world. When you think about, we'll call it the scorecard for the university, the Sequoia Capital commissioned a study in 2011 trying to put some metrics on Stanford University's economic impact via innovation and entrepreneurship. The conclusions were that clearly one of the top tech transfer engines in the world, more than 8,000 inventions, more than $1.3 billion in royalty that are plowed back into research and education, DNA cloning, the entire underpinning for the biotech world was invented at Stanford in conjunction with UCSF. Fax cell sorting. Sound synthesis chips is a really interesting story. Who knew you'd want your computer to make noise? And that discovery sat unlicensed for almost 5 years in OTL until a company you never heard of before, Yamaha, optioned the license and created the electric piano. And now, of course, the basis for all of our ringtones and sounds that come through our computers. PageRank algorithm, Larry and Sergey's little contribution has now allowed us to sift through the world's knowledge. More than 40,000 companies have been formed, more than 4 million jobs, $2.7 trillion in annual revenue, and arguably the world's 10th largest economy all has its roots in Stanford. For those that say it's only all about money, additionally, some 30,000 not-for-profit companies have been enormously valuable across many, many domains. On an annual basis, it gives you a little idea of when you take that big aggregate. There are about 3,000 disclosures that are taken to OTL every year. Only a quarter are optioned. There are currently 470 technologies in active licensing, 61 million in gross royalty payments, again, all of which is plowed back into research and education. There are relatively few that generate a large amount of money. You see the range of $12.38. That's about the range where I live at. But a clear lesson that you just don't know what is going to turn out to have a big impact. Now I want to review kind of the summary of the ecosystem that has made this place so magical. So I had been at Stanford now for 7 years, and I had read several books by Andy Grove, including Only the Paranoid Survive, and that actually was a little bit of a Bible for my first 6 or 7 years here. And through a series of back channels, I was offered 15 minutes to explain to Mr. Grove why he should do the Fogarty lecture. So he asked me what brought me to Stanford, and I said, you know, Mr. Grove, and he said, I'm Andy, okay? I said, I came because I thought the Department of Surgery had not lived up to its potential, and it was a little worse than that, but never mind. And I told him, you know, Andy, I decided I'd rather come here and fail than for the rest of my life wonder what might have been. So we made the jump. He then said, what do you think are the key factors for success in the Valley, since you seem interested and at least a little bit knowledgeable? And I said, the intellectual capital from our universities, the financial capital, and the flat hierarchy and meritocracy. And then he looked at me and he had these piercing blue eyes, and he probably said, you idiot, you missed one: risk capital. And then he said, the same thing that brought you here. And that always resonated with me. It was a priceless lesson that willingness to risk failure is a remarkable attribute that I think all of us share. And we got the gig. So Andy Grove gave the Fogarty lecture November 2nd, 2006. We had more than 400 people, standing room only, at the Arriaga Alumni Center. A real joyful occurrence to look back on. I want to say one word about adventure capital or venture capital. It really has its roots in the Valley, and while people glorify it, the truth be told, money doesn't do it, but it's the use of money in a remarkable way that creates value. Fundamentally, this is private money to fund high potential and also high risk companies. It moves well beyond banks to wealthy individuals. And importantly, from the beginning, it began to focus on the character of the entrepreneur. Was this someone that could make an impact? There's typically a 5 to 10 year horizon, and ultimately returns are only recognized with an exit, read with a sale or with a public offering. And there is roughly a third of all the venture capital in the world is concentrated in Northern California. That's created an interesting co-location, and for those with the money, they believe it provides them with a chance to provide adult supervision for the young hotshots who are trying to change the world. So I think it's fair to say, as summarized in The Economist, that you shouldn't regard Silicon Valley as some sort of economic machine where stuff's poured in at one end and stuff comes out the other, but rather as a form of ecosystem that breeds companies. And without the right soil, the right climate, nothing will grow. So the title of this, the presentation was, does Silicon Valley have a secret sauce? And the answer is no. It does have a unique ecosystem of intellectual capital, venture capital, and importantly, risk capital that changes the world. Finally, bringing those together in a flat hierarchy and a meritocracy. You know, every time you walk around Stanford campus and you see some wild-haired kid on a skateboard, he's probably a lot smarter than you are. Now I want to move on to how over the last 20 years we've tried to take advantage of that environment and ecosystem to use key resources in the Department of Surgery and beyond to advance the care of patients, not only locally, nationally, but across the globe. So if you think about it, the history of surgery, progress is always about innovation. I had an early experience with ECMO, simulation, virtual reality, and surgical robotics, as Stephanie was kind enough to indicate, and that is how the field moves forward. So 20 years ago, Biodesign was started with the manifesto that, quote, we believe the process of innovation can be taught. Our goal is to develop the next generation of med device innovators. And I think the faces say it all. Picture of Josh Mackauer and Paul Yack in the lower panel. And importantly, surgery resident Russell Wu, one of my trainees who became one of the very first Biodesign fellows. And it looked like such a good time, I asked Russell if I could come play in the sandbox as well. Paul was gracious enough to agree, and for me, the rest has been history. Our fundamental premise is bringing together in teams people who think differently together. Someone may think as a gadgeteer, someone may think as a mechanical engineer, someone may think as a circuit designer, someone may think as a biologist. We bring them together and teach them to learn each other's language, to deal with the inevitable conflict, all with the goal of taking better care of patients, solving unsolved problems. Design thinking was pioneered at the Stanford D School and IDEO, and the development of what they like to call user-centered thinking, where one empathizes with the user of this device, defines what works, think about what doesn't, prototype and test, is pretty easy when you're developing an iPhone to send to a consumer. It gets a lot trickier if the eight-headed monster that the user is called healthcare. And whether you take providers, hospitals, payers, insurance companies, the FDA, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the large healthcare providers, it all gets tricky. You add politics, you add more politics, and it makes it very difficult. So to navigate that complexity, over the last 20 years, we've evolved, like any good academic, a somewhat pedantic process of identify the problem, identify the need you're trying to solve, and we'll talk about that just a bit, invent a possible solution, and then ultimately implement. And rather than spend a lot of time talking about dry lecture and syllabus stuff, we'll tell some stories. So these are the surgical trainees, some from Stanford, some from beyond. Some of you may know Dan Azagari, who's now on the faculty, James Wall, who's also on the faculty, Katie Blevins, who's currently a surgery resident, Patrick Thompson, a vascular trainee. It's been a remark, and Tiffany Chow, who's now on the faculty at the Valley, remarkable, ditto Ron Zhao at the Valley, Benita and vascular, there's James, remarkable group of young people that trusted their career to me at a time when this was not so obvious, and I'm forever grateful for the privilege of working with them. Here's how it happens. I was in the operating room doing a big chest operation, and the anesthesiologists were trying to place an epidural catheter. And James Wall and three other guys, Zach, Ken, and Steve, were watching. This was an awake patient where they were taking a sharp stick, kind of looks like a ballpoint pencil, and shoving it in the kid's back to try to get a catheter in the epidural space. After 45 minutes, the kid's screaming, the epidural was abandoned, and the case proceeded, and we thought nothing about it. The team watched and said, we could do better. And so from concept to prototype to clinical trial, they developed the concepts, filed the patents, raised a small amount of money, 20K, raised a little more money, 100K, raised a little more, all by the simple observation of something in the hospital that didn't work. They knocked on my door and said, we've been thinking. And anytime someone knocks on my door and says, we've been thinking, I'm a sucker for making time. So they spent a bunch of time on whiteboarding, trying to understand what the basic problem is. And they came on what I would call a 5,000-year-old machine called a screw. Instead of pushing it in, twist it in. Fundamental insight, ragtag team, simply trying to solve a problem. Even more interestingly, they said, we have a little Tupperware container here, and this represents a lamb spine from a butcher store. And here you see the tip of a screw from an Ace Hardware store right where it belongs, demonstrating that this could be done. The final concept is with ultrasound guidance with a finely machined tip, more than 5 years, clinical trials in the United Kingdom. You get the idea how difficult this can be when all you're trying to do is basically develop a new catheter. Our scorecard from Biodesign over 20 years is indeed now multiple inventions, real world funding successes, 50 startups, most importantly, 220 grads, 18 other Biodesign programs. But as Stephanie said, more than 2.7 million patients treated with student-driven technology because they had the courage and had the risk, a willingness to risk, to work to try to solve that problem. We also learned that Biodesign is not enough, that as this gets more and more difficult, an out of the university stepping stone is needed, which led us to the Fogarty Institute. Fogarty Institute is a not-for-profit educational incubator on the El Camino Hospital campus, but it is not El Camino Hospital. More than 19,000 square feet of space when we got started, and founded by one of our Stanford surgery faculty members, Tom Fogarty. Tom was a scrub tech in the 1960s, and he witnessed so get that, a scrub tech, not even a medical student. He witnessed the expert surgeons of the day make a big incision from the groin to the knee, and then open the artery over that entire length to pick out clot. Then he made one simple observation. Almost all those patients came back for an amputation. So he figures, well, it may be a great operation, but it certainly ain't very great if you're a patient. So Tom, now a medical student, came up with the idea and radically rethought the way we do a big operation to simply use the artery as the highway to where the blood clot is, and using a balloon catheter to inflate the balloon beyond the clot and pulling it back. And like any radical new idea, the idea was vilified. The paper was never published. And to give you some idea of the nurturing environment that he lived in, his boss then said, "This is a dangerous device and a procedure that borders on malpractice. Only one so uninformed as a medical student would dare to think of it." So that's when people ask, why do we involve students? The answer is pretty clear. Only a student would dare to think of something that we've socialized most of our trainees to avoid. And Dr. Fogarty revolutionized endoluminal therapy, and 50 years later was a privilege to be in the White House when Dr. Fogarty was awarded the National Medal for Technology and Innovation by President Obama, 2014. And my only editorial comment will be, even with Fogarty in the White House, it was still a much saner time than it is now in the White House. Fogarty is regarded as the Godfather, and most importantly, you know, he would say, forget about these awards and acknowledgments. His most critical way of thinking about things is to leverage a new treatment to treat not just your patients, but everyone's patients. Tom likes this simple cartoon where a doctor taking care of a patient creates one, we'll call it RVU. We know that we train a next generation of physicians that multiplies. So if we can do 14,000 RVUs, each one of these does 14,000 RVUs. That trains a whole new and makes a big impact. But when we develop new solutions, that now becomes multiplied and exponential. So John and Mary Gibbon invented the heart-lung machine, Laser Greenfield, the vena cava filter, Al Starr, the original cardiac valve, Willem Kolff, dialysis. Jess Miga is now the chief medical officer at Google, and Farrell and Powell developed the E-valve and the MitraClip, which now 20 years later has absolutely changed the morbidity and mortality of mitral valvular disease. So if we could teach and enhance this at the Institute, we thought that'd be a good idea. So in partnership and in parallel, we like to think of Biodesign as doing educational activities, thinking about a business, and at the Institute, business activities in an educational environment. We move from what we learned in Biodesign through a proof of concept to the development of and ultimately the financing of an early stage medical technology, which is what is required for commercialization and patient benefit. And the good news is we have such a terrific ecosystem of great colleagues and mentors around that allow for what we like to call full contact mentoring, but it's better if your friends and colleagues are pushing and prodding rather than your enemies. So I'll give you one example of that before we close. I've tried to pick on some simple things, but big problems. This is a Fogarty company to solve the problem of postpartum hemorrhage. So I had no idea, but as a pediatric surgeon, I know a little something about labor and delivery. The #1 cause of maternal death worldwide is postpartum hemorrhage. 140,000 women die every year because of postpartum hemorrhage. And that really pissed us off. How could we possibly allow that to happen? We know that When the baby is in the uterus, the placenta connects the baby to mom. After the baby is delivered, the uterus must contract in order to stop the bleeding at the interface between the placenta. But when the uterus does not contract, huge amount of blood, roughly 20% of the cardiac output, is bleeding out into the uterus and then out. Exsanguinating hemorrhage happens in a real short time, and I can assure you this is scary as hell. Despite all of our treatments that might even include a hysterectomy, 140,000 women die every year. Again, that really, really pissed us off. Enter a simple device to create a carefully screened suction to live within the uterine cavity, a soft seal in the birth canal, and the ability to apply a light suction force to allow, one, the blood to be evacuated, two, to allow the uterus to contract, which is in the end what will solve the problem, and finally for us to accurately measure blood loss. Sounds like a good idea. You got to prove it. And this was the team that did it. So back to only the students could possibly come up with the idea. Jessie Becker was an undergrad in engineering at Cal Poly. She and her two teammates started Impress, and I was lucky enough to connect with them and bring them into the Institute. We took this simple concept and we went to Jakarta, Indonesia, where exsanguinating postpartum hemorrhage is common. When 1,500 cc's of blood, that's 3 to 4 units of blood, is ongoing, we expect roughly a 50% mortality. 10 patients were enrolled with clinical success in every one. Hemorrhage was controlled in less than 60 seconds, and all 10 women, 5 of whom likely would have died, were discharged home to their baby and their family. We figured that's a pretty good start. We've galvanized global support with the World Health Organization across some implementation partners, both regionally, nationally, and internationally. Clinical trials are ongoing. We helped them raise $1 million, hired a CEO, and I think we'll change the way postpartum hemorrhage is solved. And if we can make a good dent in 140,000 women dying every year, put that on my tombstone. So at 10 years, Fogarty is still active. And I recruited Andrew Cleland as a new CEO, and there's a growing partnership with Stanford Biodesign. This is Dr. Fogarty at his 85th birthday. We had Fogarty wine with his birthday cake. We have 6 graduate CIRs that have come out. Envision is a great example of a totally new way to think about early diagnosis of ovarian cancer, which heretofore has been notoriously difficult to diagnose and with a terrible mortality. We're opening 30,000 square feet. It's supposed to open in December. Once the pandemic is behind us, please come visit. I've tried to summarize briefly how Silicon Valley evolved. Here are some books if you have an interest in digging in more deeply. By way of a quick summary, I've given you a quick selected summary of Silicon Valley's roots and traits. We've tried to emphasize Stanford University's central role in making the Valley and also acknowledging that it wasn't just the university. We've talked a little about the 20-year track record at Biodesign and 12 years at the Fogarty Institute. Most importantly, we've emphasized that the ecosystem matters and that MedTech has some unique challenges and timelines. A weekend hackathon may work to deliver pizzas faster, but it won't work in early stage MedTech. And finally, I think the critical notion that mindset matters even more. We talked about that at the founding of the university, the founding of many of the early stage MedTech companies, sort of encapsulated in what Steve Jobs likes to say. That's the key. And that notion of learn that and never be the same again is really, I think, the fundamental thing that we try to teach to our students, our trainees, our residents, and anyone else that will seek us out. With that, I'll close. I'm happy to do whatever a chat mechanism, and thank you so much for the privilege of speaking with you this morning.